Hello, friends. Welcome back to Reiki Crossroads and Connections, where we're exploring the many pathways that you can take to bring a sense of rootedness, of spaciousness, and connection into your daily life and into the ways in which you fulfill your contribution in this world. My name is Michaela. Welcome back. It's really lovely today for me to welcome today into this conversation a person whose biography has a lot of mirroring to my own, a lot of common points along the journey, and a real kindred spirit in the way that she is enacting her purpose in the world, the elements that she's brought together to do her work in the world. So I want to welcome in my good friend, Sarah Rimmel. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi.
Hi, hi. So, Sarah, you are the founder of Slow Integration Coaching, and you're committed to people's needs being met. I love the simplicity of that, the power and the simplicity of that, committed to people's needs being met. As a certified somatic coach and intercultural strategist, she supports diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals and people committed to culture change and centering themselves and their mental and emotional well-being while they are doing the external work that they are committed to. She supports people in engaging in healing and body-based practices to strengthen connections between the mind, body, and spirit, and the environment around us. Sarah is a biracial queer woman, an auntie, a tea drinker. She has a master's of science in business management and a bachelor's in community health, and over 15 years in higher education, social justice advocacy, and nonprofits. She comes to somatic coaching through the lineage of Strozzi, which is affiliated with the generative somatics, where she was trained in 2019 and 2020 as a somatic coach. And there's just so much to dive into just in that little introduction alone. So welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here with you.
Indeed. So, Sarah, I'd love to just start off with a little bit about your pathway into the work that you're doing. We heard a bit about your formal bio, but I'd love to know a little bit about what is at the heart of this with you and maybe something about the thread that you followed to be in the position of offering this work at this time.
Hmm. I love that question. The thread I followed. Yeah, and what I find amazing is that as that's happening, or in the past, like I didn't know that that was happening, right? That I was following a thread, and then in hindsight or later, right, I get to really look back and be like, oh, things all were just really working towards where I'm at now and what I'm doing. And it's certainly been a long, and a challenging journey, particularly like the last few years of finally going out and doing, working for myself and starting slow integration coaching and, you know, being my own business, owner and just all of that. Before these last few years, I worked in higher education, so I believe you have had that in your past as well. And I would say, like, maybe just going back for a brief moment back to college, I studied community health, public health. I always like was like I want to do something of service. I always want to, do work that I feel connected to and aligned to and it feels helpful, And so most of my, like, the first 8 years, 10 years of my career of was working in different nonprofits, really, just trying to explore where do I fit in, what do I like, what do I not like. And so I worked, yeah, in a lot of small nonprofits and a lot of different sectors. And and then I found my way into early childhood education for a little while and then higher education. And when I was at a university, I was working within a diversity and equity, office. So I was working in a women's center. So we were really focused on gender equity and racial equity. And that dream, I still remember back when I got that job and when I saw the job, application or the job, description, it was just so aligned. Like I had just been doing some powerful, like, work within like a leadership, course and really getting present to what I really wanted. And, just that it like just kind of tapping into the courage, to really go after that and to trust that I had the experience. yeah, when I saw that job for the university, it was just like, everything was aligning,
Yeah.
and yeah, I was there, our office, combined with some other offices to become a new office, towards the later part of my time there. But, it was definitely a dream come true. And, universities are complex and complicated and all of that too, but there was, yeah, there was just so much, that I loved about working, on a college campus and doing work with students and getting to do social justice work with students and um and yeah, and while I was there, we were doing a lot of like DEI like trainings, and I was just personally getting more curious about somatics and embodiment, and like what does that even mean. And I had friends who went to Naropa, which is another school in Colorado, and they had gone through these somatic therapy programs. And you know yeah, I've shared this a few times as a joke, but I'll just share it real quickly and then see if you want to, share anything. But I remember a friend of mine who was, studying there, she gave me a hug and she commented on how I would hug like this, right? I would do the to others, right?
Sure.
And I didn't realize that, but like that was something about just how I connected and how I could be connected to others. And I still remember that moment because it was like this like interesting moment around like how I operate and how I connect and do things. And long story short, yeah, I got interested in that. And towards the end of my time at the university, I just really started getting curious about how do we weave in the body and what's happening in our bodies into the DEI work, right? So that we can meet people better, so that the change work can really be more effective, right? With leaders.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yeah, I love that that's where you landed, and one of these really strong parallels with this. I also worked in higher ed for 15 years and in social justice spaces, leadership development in particular, and then later in some career path support for students who wanted to go into social justice work, dealt with a lot with organizations and internships and nonprofits and so on. And at the same time was kind of developing, my own version of embodiment based practices for my own health and well-being, on the side of that. And began to feel this dissonance between the work that I was doing with students, where they were putting so much of their passion, so much of their energy into wanting to change the world, right? Like wanting to affect change in the systems that they were experiencing harm from. In most cases, most of them were coming to the work because they had experienced or witnessed harm in some way, shape, or form through often institutional structures that are harmful. And at the same time, in the context that I was working with them and that, most of the college was working with them, there wasn't space for them to do their own internal change work. I mean, certainly as college students, they're changing a lot, right? But they were coming into this work carrying hurts and carrying traumas and carrying, old stories and challenges. And that was being reflected in the work that they were doing, largely, in a hyper fixation on the problems and like really feeling bogged down in their bodies around the overwhelming nature of the problems that they were facing. And I didn't know what to do about that. Like I didn't have any, I was just starting to become aware of the internal solutions to those problems and the idea of making change from the inside out. And I experienced a lot of tension around that, and wanted to see my students getting more support in changing the presence of pain in their being so that they could approach the change work that they were wanting to do from a more spacious place, a more rooted place, a more connected place. And at the time, that was really not a welcome narrative in the college I was in. There was a really strong divide between, people who were interested in embodiment-based practices, spiritual practices, and social justice work. And our college was very heavily focused on social justice development. And it was really sad. And I felt like I had to hide that, and that there was this medicine that was not available in that space. I started to see that change towards the very end of the time that I was there. One of my bosses started to bring in trainers who would bring in somatic pieces, and that was really delightful. But it was so long that there was just this separation between these two sides of myself. And ultimately that's why I started my business, was that I wanted to find a way to knit those things together, and I'm still trying to figure out how to do that well, how to do that in solid ways. But I'm curious what your experience was within higher education, and with this budding understanding of the essential nature of embodiment-based practices, somatics work, to our lives and to change work that we want to do. To what degree that was supported or present in the college that you were in. And then, yeah, we'll follow that conversation into what we're seeing now, from the other side of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Really good to hear your story and your journey. I didn't, I also received, or felt like I received pushback, or like there just wasn't a lot. Yeah, I definitely experienced that. And I don't think there were many. Again, I was also, when I was there, just learning about this, as you said, for myself, and really starting to do some courses and explore that, right? Because it's not, the thing about somatic work is it's not something you just get to talk about, right? It's such an internal process, right? It's such an internal felt sense, experience, right? And so I was just starting to get curious about that at that time, and again start learning some of those skills. Yeah, there definitely, I don't feel like there was a lot of space, or just a lot of I don't know that I could, there was counseling folks that I got to, one of the cool things that I got to do when I was still there was, partner with them on some conversations, or a conversation for students around burnout, for student activists, right? So there were pieces, right? And when we got to partner with like our counseling office, right, there were pieces around, right, around healing, and around the, trauma informed, right, ways to support ourselves, each other, and all of that. And but in terms of like embodiment, or building those skills, or there just wasn't, it wasn't around. It wasn't, it wasn't around in conversations. And it's really curious, just that it's really interesting to think about that and to reflect on that a little bit now. Yeah, and maybe how did that show up in different ways, right? Because there were certainly conversations or events that students would put on, right, with different folks, and it touched on those things, right? We were doing sewing, right? We were like, using our hands, right? I mean, I wasn't, I didn't know how to sew, right? But there are these ways of play, right? These things that support some of the bigger picture that I feel like is important as we're exploring somatics and what that means. So there were those things, but there definitely wasn't like, at an intellectual or cognitive like understanding of like, this is what we're doing and this is how we do that more, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it does. And in a certain sense, like you said earlier, I mean, the university is such a cerebral place, right? It's about knowledge and learning and thinking and the mind. And somatics is about the body, and working with trauma, and working with internalized beliefs and the subconscious, like this is in the body. And so, in a certain sense, it makes sense that there would be this divide between a very mind-centered space and a very body-centered space. But as I think we both are aware, integration between all of our parts is an essential part of being fully human. And so I'm glad to see more openness of that. While you were talking, I just had this really kind of sad memory come up of you were saying you collaborated with the counselors. I also would collaborate a lot with counseling and with the spiritual director at the chapel at school. She was very much siloed out, like There's the chapel and the spiritual stuff. It's over there. If you want it, it's over there. And then there's everything else. And I just naturally wanted to partner with her. I mean, she was very social justice minded. Like she very much saw the connections between spirituality and everything else that was going on. And I invited her to collaborate on a event once. And she said, you should not collaborate with me because if I come, they won't come. Like the students won't come
Mm.
if I'm there in that context. And it was so confusing and so heartbreaking, right? And as I said, that was starting to shift by the end of my tenure.
Mhm.
She left to be a hospital chaplain. She just got tired of being shoved in the corner, honestly. And the
Mm.
next chaplain who came in had more experience in like student community activism and organizing, and so just was a little bit better positioned to kind of make those connections, which was great. Um, but it definitely, yeah, felt like this is a place of learning and thinking and problem solving. And those are stuff that you do in your spare time. And yet, you and I know through a lot of experience that these things enhance each other so beautifully. And so I'd love for you to talk a bit about why you see it's important, specifically in the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So you work with DEI professionals who are in the field doing this work in organizations and companies, perhaps in schools, that are, you know, doing work that is incredibly difficult and often uh, for which they often receive a lot of pushback and difficulty, or are themselves siloed out to the side. Like some of my friends who do that work, they've had the experience of either like, yes, come in and give us the requisite training, and we'll put those training manuals on the shelf, and then we'll carry on with business as usual. Or they're in the midst of messy, like deep, mucky transformation processes that it's uncertain whether they will be successful because it's so hard. And so like with that kind of backdrop, I'd really love to hear you talk about what you see as the importance of bringing somatic work into that context and maybe some of the outcomes that you've seen.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And I will share that I'm still, I'm still thinking about and feeling, like just around like the university, I'm still, my mind, my heart is still there around, so just to maybe even just name that and close that, for a moment. But, um, you know, um, because yeah, and I'm curious, like I'd be curious, like with former colleagues and and folks on other campuses too, just like what their thoughts are on what type of conversations are emerging, or what um how do they feel like they can get some more value from some more of that internal work for folks, or because yeah, even like there was so much like leadership development, and there's so many like again all these trainings, um but again, yeah, there is a difference now, like having gone through somatic work for myself, like in those things being so cerebral, and an experience that invites in the body, and and movement, and connecting to our body through those processes, right? That there's just a difference, right? And for me, that difference has been like when I left the university, I was very burnt out, right? And and so many other folks are burnt out, and I didn't realize the extent to that, right? And so yeah, I like somatics. I mean, I feel like some of this work, especially like one-on-one coaching, just helps people, in recognizing those things sooner, right? Like I think back about my time and how would that have been different if I had had some support, with somebody to be able to recognize all of the ways that I was, you know, um, limiting and putting down like my actual needs, and leaning into courage more, right? And just and even like recognizing when I was a yes or a no, or like when just what I really needed, right? And more just support to like make those choices. And that is some of the beauty of this work, is it just um invites us into like that, a little bit of that, again, just that slowing down, to get more present to ourselves and to what we need, and connected to what's important to us, and to like kind of the phrase build those muscles, right? To strengthen that, right? To strengthen, leading from those places that are aligned. I mean, with DEI, you asked, I think you asked about like the value of somatics with DEI work and maybe with other change work. And I mean, I think it's just, I think there's so much value. It's hard to sometimes put it in words, but I guess if I were to try to bring that down, it's like it's so that the change, right? Like I think other people say this, but I'm big into this. It's like how the process is really matters, right? And so we want certain outcomes, but it's like how do we create a container and a process by which we're actually like getting to practice those things, those outcomes we want, in our day-to-day interactions, in our, and even how meetings are run, right? It's like how do we I feel like I'm kind of like rambling a little bit, um, but yeah, it's just, I mean, there's just a lot of value, I think, when we really can slow down and begin to like notice what's happening for us and others, and then try to lead from there.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and it's in the name of your business, right? Slow integration coaching. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that, how you, what that name means to you, and what you see as the value of slowing down, and how that plays into all of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I mean, again, just thinking, it's so funny because I love that we're talking about higher ed too, right? Because I don't know your experience in higher ed, but at least in my experience, there was also like a sentiment that the university did move too slow, right? There was a lot of like, how does it move faster, right?
My gosh.
Right, and right. So it's interesting, and I've heard that recently was in a conversation with some DEI folks who were like, but how do we support that, like where there is that sense of urgency? How do we get that sense of urgency? And then we were in this great conversation, well, a conversation around like because white supremacy, the characteristics of that, of white supremacy culture that I'm forgetting the name of the person who created that, but we can put that into the reference. But one of them is like sense of urgency, right? And so it's really just this interesting thing to play with, like, yeah, how do we move forward? How do we make change? But how do we make change and support change that's actually not, while in the process we're not overriding ourselves, we're not there's not toxic culture, there's not like all these, whatever those things are important. It's like how do we create that urgency and move along while still caring for all of us, right? And it might be idealistic, I don't think it is, but like one of my values is like let's like how do we tend to each other, how do we like bring care to each other in the process. And then we're not going to do that, we're not going to get that right, which is why I love that concept too that exists out there of like repair. Like we can also continually like iterate, try to get better, like, and that's not available, that was not available, like in times that I've worked in certain places where there's just not enough of that slowing down, and it's not just slowing down, it's also to be able to have honest conversations, to be able to have accountability, with when leaders or whoever is not you know um not honoring the things that we might be trying to create or work towards, right?
I think this is so important, and I chuckled when you said, uh, the urgency within student culture, and then the observation of how slowly the institution moves. This was so present, and I had so much compassion for it because the students are only there for 2 to 4 years, and they want to see change, right? Like they want to make change. They want to put their mark on the place.
Yeah.
Especially the context that I was in. This was a school that really centered social justice as a value and really taught to that, trained to that. And then they would look at this institution, and it just changes at a snail's pace because they're big and complex and have been around for 150 years, and it was very frustrating. It was a very ongoing source of tension. And so I went to I did my undergraduate work at the school that I ended up working with the most. And so I did this transition from student to staff. And in that, I could start to see the other side of it, of like, oh, okay, this is why things move so slow. And this is the warped perspective that I have as a student when I'm only here for 2 years. I came in as a transfer student, so I was only there 2 years. And that's barely any time, for institutional change to happen. And so I ended up with a lot of compassion for both sides and a lot of perspective for both sides. I mean, when I first, like the first semester that I was a staff person, I started off as assisting this program and then ended up directing it by the time, pretty quickly, and then was in that role for a long time. That very first semester, a student began speaking to their experience as a trans student. It was the first time I had heard a student speak to this directly. It was a women's college, so this was there was a very specific way in which the trans experience was held and expressed inside of a gender-focused college. And it was the first time I'd heard this sense of frustration and this need for change around that issue. And the year that I left, 15 years later, right, the institution like formalized policies around trans students, and like in a way that was inclusive and equitable and really clarified, what, like, yes, we are going to remain a women's college, but this is how we've evolved what that means. We need women's colleges, or we needed them originally because of gender oppression. Gender oppression, we now understand much more broadly now, to not just be women, but to be a wider range of people. And therefore, we are going to evolve that. And here's what that looks like in policy, in our housing department, in our admissions, in our sports, in, all of these areas of college. Super comprehensive. Like, I think it was the first college in the United States to implement such a comprehensive, set of policies around trans inclusion. 15 years later. Now, I had been part of those conversations all along, right? From student forums, from protests, from, I led a series of, small discussions between alumni and current students. There was a big divide between, the older alumni who are like, this is a women's college, okay? You're not taking that away from us. And then like, okay, but here's what that means to us. And to this moment of this policy change. And I just now I'm noticing the symmetry of that. My first semester and basically my last, right? being that, but that was slow work. Relative to an individual person's life or career.
Yeah.
It was slow, and it was just a set of policies, right? But there was a tremendous amount of culture change that happened in order to make that possible, and then that became the benchmark for another wave of culture change that would happen. And so I think this question of what does it mean to be slow and to hold urgency at the same time is such an important one. And it's as you're saying, it's very tricky. And I think part of it, and I would imagine that you have a particular perspective on this, part of it is being somewhat savvy in where we need to be slow and where we need to acknowledge small incremental change as incredibly powerful and correct, and where there needs to be urgency and pressure and big change, right? That it's a multicolored palette of mindsets and actions, and that it's not one size fits all. We don't, like, as you say, having universal urgency around changing everything is, firstly, definitely a characteristic of white supremacy. I've unpacked that a lot inside of myself, and causes harm in a lot of instances when we try to change too fast, or we try to push too fast. People's viewpoints get pushed out of the way. We could go on and on about that, but I think this piece around how do we maintain a sense of compassionate pacing and still generate the motivation that we need to keep working towards change. Yeah. So if there's anything that's up for you around that, just juggling those two pieces, it feels really juicy.
Yeah, it is juicy, and I'm glad we're talking about it. One of the things that I was just getting present to as you were talking right? And is that it's just right as I've been on this learning path, right? It's when is urgency also like combined or like inflated, or maybe not inflated, but when are folks um what is their level of like to use terms that might not everybody might not get, but like regulation in the nervous system, right? So I think that like when we think about urgency or not, it's like again with slowness, it's about how can we actually like pay attention to what we're feeling, what we're needing, right? Are we operating out of some default like pattern, right? Or way of like, right? And that's, I can't tell anybody else, right? That's just for us to be in our own learning around that, right? But I think it's those things that we get to pay attention to more when we slow down. So, it's like if that makes sense, it's like how yeah, what are those default like ways that we might have picked up, are like again with conditioning, right, as well, like social conditioning, are we um maybe talking over other people, are we not speaking up at all, right? Like and again, just how calm are we in our nervous system, or how regulated are we in our nervous system, right? So when I think about urgency too, I think it's like I think that's the that's the thing that I think doesn't work, is when we're urgent and we're not regulated, right? Like we're not regulated in our nervous system, right? And because then yeah, so I'd love your thoughts too on that, just
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example of where, like, direct application of slowing down inside of urgency. So, thinking of, um, you know, being in instances where there's, um, okay, so a different school that I worked with a summer social justice program where students from two colleges lived together on in this community organization that serviced formerly homeless people and did various internships, and I was there to do a lot of this kind of work with them. And this was kind of where I started to see that shift, because this was now this was crossing over like my last 2 years at Mills, where I was working for the most part, and then the first 2 years of my business. So I worked for them for 4 years. Um, and I could start to see this shift towards an understanding that a whole person approach was important, especially if we're sending students into the front line to do work that causes a lot of burnout, causes a lot of stress, tugs on their hearts, opens up their wounds, right? And so I'm thinking of, community meetings in that context where there is this urgency, this intensity around what they're experiencing. Again, they're only in this program for, 3 months or 2 months. And then, that's connected to the rest of their career. And how easily dysregulated they would get in that system. And so, what I learned pretty quickly was that part of my role was to introduce that slowing down and that pause, and that, like, yes, there's urgency around all of the things that you need to get done this summer. And then the whole rest of your life, looking at the change that you want to make, the contribution that you feel so strongly is yours to make. But in this moment, like, we need to bring this down. We need to slow it down. We need to pause. We need to tend to your system. And, in one instance, the student was pushing so hard. She went into a panic attack in one of our community meetings. And it was like, it was a surreal experience of like everybody being really afraid of what was happening. And then me just like sitting with her in this very slow, very still space
Mm-hmm.
of like, let's just be with you are experiencing right now. It took us about an hour to kind of bring her back down, and kind of get through this serious dysregulation. But it was such a stark, just really shone a light and really threw into relief the impact and the harm that we cause when we push urgency as the methodology, right? As the way that it needs to happen, without the subtlety of regulation. And that, we talk about, like, I started doing a lot of work around self-care and like, how do we define that? And that's not just about taking a break from your job and having a vacation and then coming back to exactly the same condition, right? It's about self-care is carving out a space of caring for self in the midst of whatever it is that you're doing. And a
Yeah.
lot of times what that looked like was slowing down. I had a mentor who said, when you're pressed for time, slow down. Like it was this
Yeah.
beautiful, like,
Yeah.
paradox that was like that just hit me on the visceral level of like, oh, that's true. Like it doesn't make sense up here, but it's true. you know?
Yeah. We're more effective when we can do that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that it's that in the context of modern life and in the kinds of things that we want to change, it's actually quite revolutionary to lean into slowing down and to caring for self. And we are starting to see this more in more well-known voices. I think of Adrienne Marie Brown in that, her work with pleasure activism and with, systems work, and just really this stance of self-love and self-care as
Yeah.
social justice work, and navigating the boundaries between the urgency and the doing and the slowing down and the
Mhm.
being. And it's
Yeah.
refreshing to see it.
Yeah, I agree. I have one of her books right here too on the emergent strategy book, like which I love. Um, yeah, I think and like a concept in somatic coaching that I was just talking about this week was just like like that this idea that which is revolutionary too, right? That we can be centered in like are centered or say grounded, right? But like whatever that is for each of us, right? We can practice being centered in our anger. We can practice being centered at, let's say even in our urgency, right? But that's a different it's a difference, to to really firmly like to be moving towards something, and then also to like again just have that rootedness, that pause, just so that we can take that time, and continue to be present to what we're working towards, and right, and yeah, and I was thinking too about it's like I certainly I'm sure you've been in this case too where you're like okay like we want to get feedback from folks, and and it's like I've heard people say it's like okay you can't have at some point you have to make the decision like that it's done, right? You can't, but I think it's easy for us to like kind of talk about like talk about that in this like binary sense, but it's like I think if we do it with intention, if we do it with care, we can, we that we can do. I mean, that's something to practice too, right? Like we can really be intentional, like when we're trying to create change or get input, right? And like making space and trying to follow up with those folks, and being clear. Okay, we're gonna do 3 listening sessions, right? And then we're gonna, be complete with that, right? So I think sometimes we get like too much like, oh, like when this idea of slowing down or pausing to do those things, sometimes we can be like, okay, then we're not gonna have any change, or we're not, but it's like, no, we can that it doesn't mean that, right? So yeah, I mean you asked about some of the outcomes of like bringing somatics in and working with folks, and in the last few years, I mean there's been different things. I mean what's coming to mind right now is just um folks like being more clear on connected to their values, right, and how they're leading, through like building more awareness around like daily practices or weekly like embodied practices, folks can be doing. It's like bringing in like for some folks it's like if there's like a spirituality or our ancestors are important, it's like bringing that in, and being more present to that, in the midst of of challenging work situations. One of the things that I get to do in coaching, right, is also like supporting folks and creating a declaration, right? So something that's really going to root and anchor folks, right? And it kind of goes beyond like a New Year's Eve, intention, right? Because it's an embodied declaration. So it's like, so one of mine has been a commitment to ease, right? And so, and with that, it's like, what do I do on a daily basis to like support myself, and not just like saying that and that being, cerebral, but like, okay, I'm gonna like lower my shoulders. I'm gonna lean back, right? When I do my walks, I'm gonna, bring that to my attention and really try to practice being at ease, right? So it's like
Yeah.
these ways we just slow down and get to, again, just like practice relearning and building, some different habits.
Yeah, and part of what I'm hearing in that is the importance of integrating these things into our day to day in the context of our work, rather than, the model that I've encountered the most. And I was just talking to a friend about this. She works in a K-12 setting, in a school that has a racial justice framework to it. And this kind of model of like the intensive retreat weekend where you take everybody away and you do like, all right,
Yeah,
vulnerability boot camp. Like, let's,
yeah,
let's get into all our stuff and
yeah.
connect and let's cry. And then like, and let's have a discussion about data collection and then let's get back to it. And I asked her like, and she was very uncomfortable with that. She's like, why are you trying to make me go like deep and hard, like all of a sudden without context? I said, was there any attempt to then weave what you did in that weekend into the day to day? And she's like, no, like not at all. It was just back to business as
Yeah,
usual. And so, what I'm hearing from you and what mirrors my own experience of, when things are the most effective is when we use that time of the training or the retreat or the, coaching block or whatever it is, whatever you or I would be brought in to facilitate for a group. And that there
yeah,
is a piece built in of how to thread that, and that like this here is an initial experience, right? This is an initial experience with this material and with some aspect of yourself that
yeah,
maybe you're unaware of or you're not used to bringing into this context. And then we're going to support you in bringing that into your day to day. And so I love this idea of the declaration, that that's something that's like, okay, so what does that look like in your daily work, right? Like, what does that actually mean for you to bring
yeah,
more ease or to bring more spaciousness or whatever the thing is? Um, to set better boundaries, how does that actually look in your day to day, and to track and to acknowledge again those tiny incremental changes over time. There's a practice that I have facilitated a number of times with organizations called overcoming your immunity to change. And it's that, again, that initial like deep dive look into what is it inside of me in my subconscious, in my body, that is blocking me from making this change that's important that I want to make, either in my life or in my job or whatever. It's probably in all of the places. And then a systematic, simple, slow process of unfolding that and integrating that so that the change unfolds over time. And that's when I've seen success, is when the organization kind of partners with me in acknowledging the need for that arc, right? That it's like there's only so much that I can do that's going to be lasting and actually benefit you guys if what we do is in a day or a weekend. And if what we have is a day or a weekend, then let's make that day or that weekend about slowing down and being like having like connecting and having a juicy time, like, right. But if you
yeah,
want to like, if you want something to change about the culture or the experiences people are having in their job, in this community and the work that they're doing, then we have to thread it into the day to day, or it's not going to mean anything. In fact, it could
yeah,
be counterproductive because it could be like, oh, this is just lip service. You make us take a whole day out of our work day or a whole weekend to come to work and like do all this vulnerability stuff, and then like, and then what? You know?
yeah, yeah. And then it just like feeds into that piece of like burnout, right? And um, yeah, yeah. I'm definitely like, I think much more like not a fan of just these long trainings, right? Or like these intensive, unless like, yeah, like, and really being thoughtful about that, unless they're like they are woven in, right? As you're saying, right? Which really takes that commitment, that deep, that true deeper commitment to whatever that change is, right? or whatever could be possible through, through doing some work, you know. But yeah, I always think of, also it's like what might I be training or supporting somebody in, whether it's, I was just having a conversation before around like intercultural competence, right? And that's around how do we build our awareness of differences and similarities with others, right? And how do we navigate, those differences and similarities, right? And so I've done some group trainings on that, right? But then it's like, how do I always like it is really important to think and support leaders also in like, okay, how are you going to reinforce this, right? Because with any training, with any topic, it's like then it's just out, it's gone, it's you do it unless it's like, okay, so like what are those things that we can be doing to reinforce that, right? In the daily, in the in the weekly, in the team meetings, whatever that might be. But yeah, I think that's certainly why coaching and some other, services and methodologies like really do work over time, right? Because you also get to create that container, and you really just yeah, have space for everything to emerge and to get to work with things and, play with things and do it again.
Yeah, right. Iteration, right? Because that's the other thing. It's like, oh, we're going to do it once and then it's done. It's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
this is internal change. This is big change, inside out
Yeah.
change, and has to go into systems in the external world. And I just really want to like send appreciation to, the people out there who are in leadership roles who hold authority inside of organizations and groups and teams who value this and who are like, yes, I will partner with you. I will put the resources towards this. I will figure out how to sacrifice, move things
Yeah.
around that I can give my staff the time, and when I do an immunity change coaching arc with organizations, for example, the first thing is to really lay that out with the leaders and say, are you willing to find a way to give them time to do this work that's inside of their normal work hours, right? That does not require them to step outside of that, but to make
Yeah.
space, and here's how much time I'm talking about. And are you willing to go through the process as well and to be transparent about that, to share that with your staff, and model that with them? So just, big appreciation to leaders and people who hold positional power who are willing to, get uncomfortable in that way, modify routine in those ways, because it really matters, and it makes lasting change in the ways that people say they want. And I've seen it happen, and it absolutely can happen. So
Yeah. Yeah, and if I can add to that, just like it takes courage, right? To be in leadership positions and authority positions and to be doing that work and to say yes to this work, and especially because, like I don't know, like in a lot of ways, there's a lot of pressure on like leaders, right? Like having it all and like knowing it all, right? And having it all figured out. And so to also have leaders like move into that place of like, okay, we're impacted by the culture we're in, and like we're the learning mindset, right? And we're really gonna practice that, amidst all of the pressures and all of the things, right? And all of yeah, there's a lot on leaders, right? There's a lot, um and I think it really makes a difference though, because folks, they can um, really again then just return to themselves in their own leadership as they are doing the work, to lead others. So yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it does my heart good to have this conversation and to just kind of be in colleagueship with you who has such a similar path, and to really reinforce how many different systems of practice are available to us when we want to integrate the many aspects of our life to be more rooted, to be more spacious and connected. And that, whether it's the system of Reiki, whether it's somatics work, whether it's yoga, whether it's immunity to change, there's just so many pathways to get us there. But the point is to lean into those pathways and to acknowledge the importance of integrating our whole self, not only here in our own experience, but in our work and in our families and in our communities and in all of the places that we hold influence and all of our spheres of influence. And so I really appreciate the work that you're doing, the consciousness that you bring to the importance of these things. And it's been really fun talking with you.
Yeah. Yeah, it has. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. So I will, of course, put your website down below for folks who want to have a conversation with Sarah about her work, about how you might connect to bring this work into your spheres of influence. I know you also have a meetup group. There's also other ways that people can connect with you and learn a little bit more about how you do your work. Anything there that you want to share?
Yeah, I'll share with, my link tree. It has the meetup information. I do like monthly free gatherings, especially particularly for DEI folks, diversity, equity, and inclusion, professionals to just, be in a space of co-learning and, around somatics. And yeah, and then if folks want to talk or connect around, individual coaching or team coaching, and really being able to support your team and really bringing somatics and healing and more effectiveness, to your team. Like, yeah, I would love to chat and connect more. So, yeah,
Amazing. Well,
yeah,
all of that will be down below in the description. And folks who are listening, we would love to hear your stories that intersect with this conversation, where you have seen the importance of slowing down in your spaces, where you have run into the frustrations around urgency, or have longed for more of an inside out approach to the work that you do. And as you go through your day, as you go through your life, seeking that slow, deep, integrated way of being, may you be deeply provisioned for it. Thanks so much for
yeah.
listening. We love you. Until next time, bye bye.